The Guyana Business Journal and the Caribbean Policy Consortium presents Transforming Guyana. In each episode, Dr. Blackman and Dr. Lewis will tackle a different area of interest for transforming Guyana.
Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to episode 2 of Transforming Guyana. I am Terrence Blackman, Associate Professor of Mathematics, Medgar Evers College, and founder of the Guyana Business Journal. On June 8, 2022, the Guyana Business Journal and the Caribbean Policy Consortium launched a series of webinars entitled Transforming Guyana. These webinars aim to bring experts and prominent voices from Guyana and the diaspora and around the world to discuss the impacts of Guyana's oil and gas development, aim to offer a nuanced look at the opportunities and the potential and pitfalls ahead for Guyana, explore strategies to maximize the positive impacts of oil revenues on Guyana's people and her future, while mitigating the risks that other countries have faced, and to identify promising roles that the diaspora could play in this transformation. In today's episode 2, we address the question of balancing the exploitation of oil and gas resources and protecting the environment. The essential question for Guyana is this: the world must dramatically cut fossil fuel consumption to achieve its climate change goals. But climate change success may put developing countries like Guyana, rich in fossil fuels, in an almost no-win situation. Suppose there's no progress in combating climate change. Well, in that case, developing countries are likely to be disproportionately harmed by floods, droughts, and other weather-related problems spawned by the warming planet. But if there is successful global action to address climate change, poorer countries, rich in fossil fuels, will likely face a steep fall in the value of their coal, gas, and oil deposits. Likewise, if the world permanently moves away from fossil fuels, the likely result will be a considerable reduction in the value of our natural wealth. Guyana faces particular challenges in this regard. And today, to discuss the strategy for exploiting our oil and gas resources and protecting the environment, we're joined by Dr. Lewis, and I are joined by Kemraj Parsram, Executive Director of Guyana's Environmental Protection Agency, Dax Driver, the President and CEO of the Energy Chamber of Trinidad and Tobago, Lorraine Sobers, Fulbright Scholar and Lecturer at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, and Dr. Neville Trotz, who's known to many of you, former Dean of the Faculty of Natural Sciences at the University of Guyana, former Director of the Institute for Applied Science and Technology at Turkine, Guyana's Science Advisor to the Commonwealth Secretary General, and Science Advisor to the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. So please join me in welcoming them all to the program. And let me now invite Dr. Lewis for a few introductory remarks.
Good morning, Terrence, and good morning to all my colleagues here, and good afternoon for some of you not in the region. We're really excited to launch episode 2 of this monthly program, Transforming Guyana, between the Guyana Business Journal and the Caribbean Policy Consortium. I'd just like to mention a few quick points with regards to this overall situation on the so-called dichotomy between fossil fuels and renewables, low carbon strategies, and climate change. I think first and foremost is in the region and in Guyana particularly, the energy economy and growth is hot. And what that means is you take advantage of it while it's hot. You try and maximize opportunities, both in terms of investment, economic growth, and then, of course, the key issue for everybody in a developing economy, and now in all economies in the world, maximizing jobs and income for people. Likewise, there is a commitment, particularly within the region, but at the level of the hemisphere and globally, as we saw at the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles 5 weeks ago, to continue pushing on the climate change issues and initiatives, and particularly the low carbon strategies that many countries have developed, and in this case, Guyana is advancing. And the need to balance that with the economic needs and the income needs in a global war, inflation, and energy shortage economy. Third and finally, what we're seeing now is dormant and quiet situations in the rest of the Caribbean with regards to oil and gas exploration are now being reactivated precisely because of these challenges at the economic level and the perception that there are opportunities for other markets in the region with regards to this. So clearly another big challenge on that front. I will close off by just mentioning in our business, I tease people that we now have a new pro bono client. The 2 billion people in the world who do not have 24/7 electricity, water, or telecommunications like we have now, and the need to balance out the global, regional, and national challenges of climate change and low carbon strategies with their desire and what I would call a fundamental human right in the 21st century to have 24/7 access to electricity and utilities. So we hope these discussions would shed some light on many of these challenges and opportunities and open the door for more people getting involved in the discussion beyond the key players of government, businesses, companies, and so on. So thank you, Terence, and welcome all, and we look forward to this discussion.
Thank you, David. Well, we couldn't start a program of this sort without going to the Dean of Guyanese climatology. And so with those remarks, I welcome Dr. Neville Trotz to make this concrete for Guyana. Dr. Trotz.
Thank you, Terence, and good morning, colleagues in the panel and participants. As Terence mentioned, I come to you from the climate change background, having been involved for the last 25 years, helping Caribbean to deal with the impacts of climate change and to prepare for dealing with those impacts. So where are we now with respect to the climate change challenge in Guyana and in the Caribbean? We have all been party to the Paris Agreement, which was an international agreement signed in 2015 in Paris. And the goal of that agreement is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius, compared to pre-industrial levels. And to achieve this long-term temperature goal, countries aim to reach global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible to achieve a climate neutral world by mid-century. And the whole idea is that by 2050, we would be carbon neutral. That means that all the carbon that we would generate in our activities would not add to the global budget because we would have sinks to absorb that. Net zero carbon status. Now, pretty soon afterwards, the IPCC had called for a report, a special 1.5 report, which we have been fully supporting the 1.5 level. And what that report showed is that on a business as usual trajectory, nothing had changed really, that we are likely not to achieve 1.5 at the end of this century, but rather by 2040. This is frightening. That is, we are running out of time basically to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So that is something that we need to keep in mind. Very quickly, what are realities now in Guyana? At present, the rate we risk surpassing 1.5 by 2040. So let's keep that factor in mind. We are running out of time in which to phase out the fossil fuels, and in which to, for us, another important aspect, to adapt to climate change. As a developing country, Guyana does not have the financial resources to transform the energy sector or to build resilience to climate change, which we have to. If even we stop putting fossil fuels in the atmosphere by tomorrow, we have enough in there to cause us quite a lot of harm, as we are seeing, droughts, floods, forest fires, heat waves. We are committed. We are living in a world committed to climate change. So that it is very important that we also look at adaptation, which is as critical for us as mitigation, as phasing out fossil fuels. The other issue is that fossil fuels will be a part of the equation for some time to come. There will be a market for fossil fuel as we aim to phase out the use of fossil fuels. The other is the need to adapt to impacts that are caused by the existing greenhouse gas concentration. So if we keep these things in mind, time, resources, particularly, we don't have the resources. We have two options now, Guyana as oil producer. The options, first option, leave the resources in the ground, which is a no-starter. The only way we can afford to do that is if our developed country partners agree to provide us with a compensation for not utilizing those resources, so that we have the resources to phase, to move to zero carbon level, and also to adapt to climate change. The other option, which I want to examine a bit further, is to exploit and use the resources that we generate from oil and gas to accelerate the transformation, our transformation to zero carbon status for the energy sector, and a climate resilient Guyana through adaptation. At the present situation, as I said, we are on a trajectory to surpass the 1.5 degree target by 2040. Right now, we are at, the world is a 1.1 degree Celsius warmer than pre-industrial times. So we just have a 0.4 degree left. Our constraints, however, major constraint, the lack of resources for both the transformation of the energy sector and for building climate resilience. Guyana, with its oil revenue, could now be in a position to accelerate both. Highest priority for the use of fossil fuels should be accorded to transforming the energy sector to achieve the zero carbon status in the globally prescribed time frame, and to build climate resilience across all of our agriculture, water, health systems. In fact, Guyana's low carbon development strategy has identified key actions that require for effective adaptation across all sectors. And indeed, They have developed a climate resilience strategy and action plan and prioritize adaptation in 4 areas: sea defense, drainage and irrigation, agriculture, health, and actually put a label to it. So what I would recommend, first of all, that the priorities for the resources from our oil wealth should go, first of all, to the implementation of the CRAS, that is to build climate resilience, to make sure that our coast, for instance, is protected from sea level rise and from the vagaries of a changing weather regime. The second, for the transformation of our energy sector, 100% renewable in a globally prescribed time frame, and to support and moving out of Guyana. There's been a lot of talk of CARICOM about energy security. I'm quite, okay, we should support energy security during the transition of the region to zero carbon status. That's for CARICOM's energy security. At the last heads meeting, they were talking about reviving PetroCarib. We now have the resources between Suriname, Guyana, Trinidad to look at the PetroCaricom and to internalize that energy security thrust. How about a regional investment fund for the transformation of the regional energy sector to zero carbon status? The whole Caribbean, we are all committed to zero carbon by 2050, but we don't have the resources to do it. Those resources will come easier than the resources for building climate resilience because that's an investment. What the Americans are talking about to the energy sector, they're looking at American investment to transform our energy sector to zero carbon. But the investments we will have to borrow from overseas sources as investments we'll have to pay back. And it's a fail-safe investment because the internal rate of return on energy investments are quite favorable. So why not internalize that by using some of the revenues generated from Suriname, from Guyana, and from private sector in the Caribbean to have our own investment fund? We are talking about food security. Why don't we look at taking the Trinidad facilities out of mothballs, particularly with food security, and making sure that the investments, the inputs that we need for the agricultural sector, the fertilizer, is in the Caribbean? Why don't we move at making that value chain, internalize the value chain, so that we generate the oil for the petrol for food, for energy security internally by using our resources, refining with the resources that we have. Similarly, for agriculture, doing the same thing. It's an opportunity for us to look internally at how these resources, Guyana, Suriname, Trinidad, could contribute to the Caribbean. Finally, I feel that way the oil economy of Guyana and Suriname would have contributed to the region's timely transition to a carbon neutral Caribbean that is well fortified to meet the challenges of a changing climate. Guyana and Suriname can demonstrate one way in which poor developing countries can face the paradox of being a fossil fuel producer and at the same time espousing the tenets of the Paris Agreement and the global imperative to achieve a zero carbon world by 2050. So we have an opportunity. Will we grasp it? That's the question. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Truss. So I guess the person who is responsible for, at this moment, for whether or not we're going to be able to grasp that opportunity, the person whose mandate it is to facilitate, promote, facilitate, and coordinate effective, sustainable management of and protection of Guyana's natural resources is Mr. Kemraj Parsaram. And so tell us, Kemraj, how are you working on grasping this opportunity? You're muted.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Blackman, for the opportunity. And good morning to my colleagues on the panel. And of course, good morning to the viewers and listeners of this program. Indeed, I have a very huge mandate to fulfill with the agency on which I am the executive director, which is the Environmental Protection Agency. And this agency, its mandate, as you mentioned, is to provide for the management, conservation, protection, and improvement of the environment, prevention and control of pollution, and sustainable use of natural resources. That's our broad mandate. But I want to say this, is that we believe that environment and development are not mutually exclusive. And as some probably would have you believe, that the Environmental Protection Agency is here to perhaps prevent development. That is not the case. Our role here is to facilitate development and to ensure that whatever development activity, in this case, oil and gas, is in keeping with the Environmental Protection Act and, of course, the broad environmental safeguards available. Now, how do we do this? We do this through the regulatory framework, which is mainly the Environmental Protection Act, CAP 2005, and the associated regulations. It speaks to air quality, water quality management, noise, etc. And there are a suite of other regulations and acts of Parliament: the Petroleum Exploration Production Act, the Pesticides and Toxic Chemical Controls Board Act, and of course, international conventions and protocols that we are signatories to and obligated to ensure implementation here. Now, I also want to mention, and Dr. Trotz mentioned this, our low carbon development strategy and the revised one, which is in draft currently, which is the LCDS 2030, which basically sets out and builds on the previous low carbon development strategy, focusing on establishing incentives which values the world's ecosystem services and promoting these as essential component of a new model for global development and sustainability at its core. In our case, it's harnessing our ecosystem services and our natural resources to ensure and build a long-term low-carbon diversified economy. And that strategy focuses on 4 key tenets. One, which is to create incentives for a low-carbon economy through sustainability planning, or forestry, or biodiversity, or water resources, or ocean and marine resources. Secondly, to protect against climate change and biodiversity loss through climate adaptation, resilience, and so on. Stimulating future growth and clean energy and low-carbon development, and aligning with global climate and biodiversity goals. So those are the key elements and the key aspects of our regulatory framework. Now, the EPA, we have this role of ensuring and basically what you call an environmental authorization of development activities, in this case, the oil and gas. And we have a robust system as provided for an act, which sets out how we evaluate proposed development activities through a process of application for authorization. And in the case of oil and gas, we receive an application and it's provided for the act and a schedule for any activities that are responsible for harnessing mineral resources or forestry resources required to apply for an environmental authorization. Our act do not mandate environmental impact assessment. It is left to the agency as the competent authority to evaluate these projects based on the information provided and determine if an environmental impact assessment is required or not. And that is what we do. Now, in the oil and gas sector, and of our experience, majority of the production projects went and we required an environmental impact assessment, and that process was followed. Now, having gone through the environmental impact assessment process, which resulted in an environmental permit or an authorization of those activities. We ensure that there are adequate and some key safeguards in place. So, for example, we require that the available and best appropriate and best available technology are utilized in the development of the activity and in the operation of the activity. And we follow guidelines and supports from, for example, the American Petroleum Institute, the International Oil and Gas Producers, for example. Key thing, we require an oil spill response plan that must be audited and includes regular practical drills, for example. We require that safety case plans are provided to us before any well drilling and development occurs. We require some simple preventative aspects in terms of spills, such as a blowout preventer. We require a cap and stack. And as you can know from learning from Macondo and post-Macondo, a cap and stack was part of the new technology being used to prevent and to address and deal with spills in the event it occurs. And so we require cap and stack in country and, of course, maintaining additional subscriptions internationally. The important thing in terms of emissions, routine flaring is strictly prohibited. However, we provide for, in the case of upset conditions and special circumstances, an approval process and a request for approval to the EPA, which we then evaluate and determine if we shall grant flaring for a particular period. And if that approval is exceeded or the period that we set out, there is a tax imposition on the tons of carbon that is flared. Importantly, we also require, and we're developing this, we're not fully completed, but we require financial assurance, and in the form of an insurance by the company to cover its activities, both exploration as well as production. And then we're now developing the parent company guarantee. And now this is being informed by a worst case scenario spill and the estimate of the reasonable, credible cost for cleanup and well control. And in addition to all this, and one final key thing is our requirement for monitoring of the effects from this activity. And I want to mention that we have in place real-time monitoring capabilities, which we're building, so we can remotely monitor what's happening offshore. If there's a spill detection, if there's flaring, we can real-time see and evaluate the amount of flaring and identify if there are spills and so on. So this is how specifically we're dealing with the oil and gas sector here in Guyana. And of course, in terms of climate change, our flaring and the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, the key thing here is routine flaring is strictly prohibited. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamraj. There are a few questions that I want to ask, but I will withhold those until the very end. We've listened in some detail to the real minutiae of what this job entails, and so I want to come back to this at some point later in the program. I want to introduce now Dr. Lorraine Sobers, who is coming to us from the University of West Indies and wrote recently a really nice piece called Finding the Balance, Lessons from Trinidad and Tobago. And so I thought we should take advantage of her expertise to, as you listen to Director Parsaram, give us some sense of how Trinidad and Tobago has sort of found the balance or lessons that can be learned in this context. Dr. Sobers.
Thank you. Good morning. So what I'm going to look at is basically more the Guyana case and some of the options. I think Guyana has a very unique challenge and unique opportunities within the transition that is upon the world. So first and foremost, because this affects lives. It's not just words on paper. Guyana is susceptible to the anticipated and the current effects of climate change. For Guyana, we would think firstly of the sea level rise, as Dr. Truss mentioned. There's need for resilience there. The change in rainfall patterns, the flooding, and so on. We've seen the disasters. Some of us see it more than others, depending on where we live in the that affects food security, water security, housing, agriculture, business. It really is destructive to small island developing states, CARICOM states, and Guyana in particular. Climate models show that the current seawall is no match for what is anticipated. So the challenge, one of the major challenges is that we expect climatic events. There's a cost to this. Guyana and the small island developing states and Caribbean states are already paying for that. It's a challenge to our development when funds need to be channeled towards recovery, right? For some reason, Trinidad and Tobago keeps getting away from it, so I don't think there's a lesson we can learn from Trinidad and Tobago, where they, especially Trinidad, they don't get the full brunt of these storms. It very well could be a case of one step forward, two steps back, and it's really on the climate. So what has been there's been a call in addition to funding for mitigation and adaptation. We get that from the Green Climate Fund and a few others that is not as accessible as we would like. There needs to be some funding that is considered for recovery, right? Climatic events that are already happening. Now, Guyana, the question of this episode is: does Guyana have a right to produce oil and gas? Because on one hand, we have climate change, and on the other hand, we have activities that contribute to that. And on the third hand, if we have three hands, would be the action that Guyana is already taken to has taken to to limit that, to mitigate that. So Guyana has been a long time champion of climate action, both in words, as the president often has several times represented to the Conference of the Parties meetings, and also on the ground. And so one of its pride and joy, of course, is the forest conservation policy. And it's a way that very few countries and gas can show that they have an overall negative sink, right? So there's that, but there's need to go a bit further, and there's opportunities to go further. I would suggest tracking the CO2 emissions per capita and having a cap for that, or keeping that definitely in sight. What has gone on Trinidad and Tobago side is that we have switched 1960s, 1970s progressively to using natural gas for energy, for electricity generation, right? So that's all well and good, but there's carbon dioxide emissions that comes from that. And then we have the downstream development at the Point Lisas Industrial Estate. Now, at the time when Trinidad and Tobago switched from fuel oil to gas, that was a big, bold move, investing in the 56-inch pipeline, cross-country 56-inch pipeline. That was also a bold move, and it reduced the emissions of this country. However, now we are consistently the top 10 of CO2 emissions per capita. And with Guyana having a small population, that number could also be high. But then Guyana has these large sinks, these large sinks in the forest, with the standing forest and the low rate of deforestation. So another thing that Guyana is doing that is good is that they are establishing a carbon registry and looking once again to earn revenue from that standing forest, and that would have to be accounted one time. So basically, if they have sold those credits or intend to sell those credits to another country or another producer, well, then it can't be counted against the production that they have. So that's another balance that is needed. Just looking at my notes here. So we look at the environmental side of things. and what's going on with oil and gas production. Um, so Guyana is set to produce over 1 million barrels per day before the end of the decade, and that is just astonishing growth. The intention that is laid out in the low carbon development strategy for the country speaks to using renewable energy. So, from the oil production to develop renewable energy with hydropower in particular, and then, of course, solar. And solar is going to broaden the access of reliable energy. And then gas to power is being considered. And gas is being considered as a transition fuel. But the way I look at it, if there's any shortcoming with the renewable energy plans, gas is going to be prominent. And it may where the transition does not go as far as some people anticipate. So that is something to keep our eyes on. With regards to the right straight question, with the right to produce, the rest of CARICOM is supporting Guyana's right to produce, and so are the African countries who have gone ahead. They have resources. They also have challenges with energy access. I would just close off with a very strong statement from the African Energy Chamber before we hear from Trinidad and Tobago Energy Chamber. Just finding the quote here. All right. The African Energy Chamber recently met, and their statements were in regard to the move towards eliminating fossil fuel producing from investment portfolios. And they were calling actually for the African countries to boycott companies that block fossil fuel investments, right? So on the investment side, there's a war brewing there, and or battle, I should say, brewing there. And so that is also part of the balancing act. My overall take is I agree with Dr. Trott that Guyana should its climate resilience, and basically Guyana should prioritize its survival.
Thank you, Dr. Sobers. So we're fortunate to have you followed by the head of the Energy Chamber for Trinidad and Tobago. So, Dr. Driver, weigh in on this matter for us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. I'm actually joining you from London, where I'm just here for a week. London, a city which I know well and love. I went to university here. One of the things that I really enjoy doing when I'm in London is going for a running. I'm a keen runner, and I like running along the Thames. So one of my favourite runs in London is along the south bank of the Thames, from Putney to Westminster. And I did that the other day, and as I was running, there's a few things I noticed which I think are pertinent for this conversation. The first thing, I passed a place called Molasses House in an area called Plantation Wharf. Molasses House, Plantation Wharf in London. So I just wondered if the residents of this really lovely housing development, how they feel about the fact that they're living in a development named after plantations producing molasses produced by enslaved Africans brought to the Caribbean from Africa, and that the capital which was produced from that, which sort of ran the Industrial Revolution or sparked the Industrial Revolution. I sort of wonder how people feel about living in a place called Molasses House, and if they think about the implications of that. You then, as you go further, you run past Battersea Park, and then past the iconic, beautiful Battersea Power Station. It's a big building in the middle of London on the Thames. Started production in the 1920s right through to the 1980s. It's a beautiful building. It's being preserved now, even though it's out of commission. But that's a coal-fired power station, which at its peak used to burn over 1 million tons of coal per annum. Coal brought to London from South Wales and the northeast of England on ships and burnt there to produce electricity for London. As you go a little bit on further, you get this whole redeveloped area around Vauxhall Station. Used to be, in my days of living in London, sort of not very nice warehouses. Now it's beautiful flats, very well maintained, but strangely empty. There's hardly anybody there. So it's actually lovely for running through there. The reason that they're empty is that these flats have been bought mostly by investors as an investment vehicle. And a lot of those investors are either Russians or Middle Eastern investors using oil money. who invested in this property here in London. So I hope the implications of what I'm saying that are clear, but I'll be frank about it, and let's make this point clearly, that nobody living in affluent London has the moral authority to tell anybody living in Georgetown, in Paramaribo, or in Port of Spain that they need to leave their oil and gas in the ground to stop climate change. The affluence of this city has been created through the fossil fuels which have built the world. It may not feel like that now in London, but that's what has built the modern world, and that's what's created the affluence and the wealth. And so people just don't have the moral authority to tell a country like Guyana to leave your oil in the ground. But that said, I will say a few words about the energy transition and the implications of that for Guyana and for other Caribbean countries, and some of the things which I think should be a policy focus for the Caribbean. The first thing to say, I think we need to be very clear that stopping fossil fuels production in the Caribbean will have no impact upon global climate change. The problem is the consumption of fossil fuels. It's not the production of fossil fuels where we need to put the focus. So the focus has to be first and foremost on stop burning coal for electricity generation. The biggest impact on reducing emissions which we've seen in the world has been switching from coal to gas-fired power. So of course, we need to bring the renewables in, and that is happening, but it has to happen faster, but it has to happen rapidly. But gas has a key role to play in that. Gas and renewables balance nicely, as Lorraine Sobers was just saying. They're two things which work well together. Gas is also important as a feedstock for fuels like hydrogen and methanol, which are going to be the key fuels to also help reduce emissions from the hard to abate sectors like the marine transport sector and some of the industrial processes. So coal to gas, that is the most effective short-term change that needs to happen in the world to reduce emissions. Now, unfortunately, what we're seeing at the moment, because this invasion by Russia of the Ukraine, that Europe now is trying to stop importing Russian gas. And so what that means, very understandably and rightly, but that means we are seeing things moving in the opposite direction at the moment, with coal-fired power stations being brought back online because of the problem of Russian gas, of cutting off Russian gas. And we're seeing these global efforts to increase natural gas production and investments in pipelines for natural gas and the LNG infrastructure. And there's a big drive to deliver more gas to those major markets. But I think we need to be careful that geopolitically driven desire does not change the fundamental drives towards net zero. And that fundamental drive towards net zero is what is driving company strategies. And indeed, the desire to wean off Russian gas is actually meaning the European Union as a key market for gas is redoubling its efforts to bring in renewables. So the energy transition is here. Of course, there are countercurrents which will happen, but that change is happening, and Caribbean people need to take that seriously as well. With the oil industry, what's going to drive that change is the electrification of transport. Electric cars are coming, and the pace of change is accelerating. There are some markets where electric cars already dominate almost 100% of new car sales. Norway is the obvious example. But even just globally across the whole world, EV sales doubled between 2020 and 2021. It started from a small base, but when you're doubling sales, we know that change is happening rapidly. So we are seeing EVs are going to be taking over. That erodes demand for oil long term. Yes, there will be internal combustion engines on the roads for many decades to come, but don't miss that big change which is happening with electrification of transport. It's happening. The international oil companies, their long-term investment strategies are based upon that reality, and they're going to keep looking at that. So for countries like Guyana and Suriname, with these massive oil resources in place, and some of them being transitioned into reserves now and being produced, the priority has to be to fast track that development of those resources. Now, this is something which Guyana has done extremely well on since its first discovery. In fact, it's a world leader in fast tracking its discoveries. So I think that key message of get your resources to market as quickly as you possibly can is just a key one that policymakers in the Caribbean need to take into account. Otherwise, you're going to be left with stranded assets that you can't monetize in the future. So there will be discovered oil resources around the world which will be left in the ground. Okay? But be careful of the people who are telling you to leave your resources in the ground when they themselves are producing. I had a few other points to make. I will just make them very quickly.
I think you should go ahead and make them.
Monitoring, reporting, verification stuff that Lorraine was talking about is really important. Guyana needs to invest in that. The other thing, measuring methane emissions, very important. I think that has to be part of it as you're bringing gas to shore. I'm just flicking through quickly here I think one of the things just two final things I'd say for policy suggestions for Guyana, which other people may not have mentioned quite so much. One is, three of them. So the first one is that as you're bringing renewables on your grid, as you're bringing natural gas onto your grid, you also need to invest heavily in the grid itself. You need to have a really robust grid, which is able to bring those other forms of energy in. And demand for electricity is likely to be going up very rapidly in Guyana. As the GDP grows, the demand for electricity will go, and that countries have gotten themselves in problems with that in the past, Ghana being the key example. But so invest in the grid, make sure the grid itself is really resilient and able to take the different forms of electricity. Make sure then also that you're continuing to push energy efficiency. We often focus on renewables, but the electricity, the electricity which you don't use is the most valuable electricity. And so put that big effort on energy efficiency. A lesson from Trinidad is when we had our boom in the 2000s, we built a lot of new buildings and we did not focus on energy efficiency. And so they're very inefficient buildings and they waste a lot of energy. So I think that's something which EPA and others in Guyana should focus on. Last point, subsidies, avoid subsidies. If you're putting them across the board, that just drives inefficiency, drives the wrong policy decisions. Subsidize getting electricity to the poorest houses, subsidize public transport. Don't subsidize across the board subsidies. That will get you in trouble, like we have found in Trinidad. So those are my key messages. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dax. David, can you kind of sum this up for us?
Well, I think that would be way too much of a task, but I do want to add a few issues and then open for the comments from the rest of the panel, because I really think that's where the value added. I'm glad that Dax mentioned the issue of efficiency, because that's one of the points I wanted some feedback on in terms of the development of a reliable and sustainable grid and the situation with utilities, not only in Guyana, but anybody to comment on the rest of the Caribbean, where I know it's a challenge in some countries, and how to blend in this opportunity in terms of national, regional energy production in Guyana and the Caribbean, and then how we use that to build up that efficiency and resilience of the grid and many of our utilities. Tied to that, and I'm glad Dax mentioned the issue of electric vehicles and the role of electricity, but at the end of the day, in order to produce electric charging stations and so on, we need to produce power somewhere. So that balance, I think, is something that we never always discuss. And where does that power come from? Will it be able to be 100% solar, renewable source? Is there a transition period with fossil fuels? I'd be interested in comments on that. And then third, but not last, in one of our white paper webinars earlier this year, we discussed the opportunity for Guyana, but also for all of the Caribbean, to jump stages by being able to have access to the most advanced and modern and efficient energy technologies anywhere in the world. My dream is that in 10 years, Caribbean utilities could be the most efficient, technology advanced, and modern utilities in the world. Is that possible? Isn't that something we could take advantage of and use the technology transfer to bolster the commitment to low carbon strategies, to renewables, to the climate change goals? Because we do need utilities, and I know many of our utilities are very inefficient and produce too much carbon gases and too many emissions right now. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So I noted I wanted to bring some questions. So first, perhaps going to Dr. Driver, the question was, how do you measure the rate at which, or how, and perhaps to Mr. Kemraj Parsram, how are we tracking how fast we're moving to renewables?
Well, I can't really comment. There's Guyana government policy, so I think that Ken Wright would be better placed to offer some perspectives on that. I could offer some views, but I think it needs to be an official response first, I guess.
Well, there is the Guyana Energy Agency, and they have been leading the energy front, from the energy front, in terms of how they implement and moving in terms of the implementation of renewables. Now, as I mentioned, and Dr. Truss mentioned, the Low Carbon Development Strategy 2030 heavily focusing on that transition from the aspect of bringing gas to shore, so the natural gas aspect as a transition a fuel source, and replacing over time the heavy fuel oil. At the parallel, the GEA is promoting renewables in terms of wind, solar, and hydro. So there are several hydropower, small hydropower as well as large hydropower that they're looking to put into action. Of course, the low carbon development strategy is currently being finalized, and then we expect that the policy and the directions and how that will be fast tracked and developed further will be outlined in that strategy. Yeah.
Can I say something?
Sorry.
Yes, Dr. Such, go ahead.
Yeah, yes, just to assure Dax and David that these are issues that are very much on the regional agenda under the responsibility of SICRI, our regional center for renewable energy and energy efficiency. And they're working very closely with utilities and national energy organizations to ensure that these things are in place.
If I could just perhaps a little sort of broad vision based upon on that about the work that SICRI is doing as well, and I think this is important for Guyana. There is a massive potential demand for electricity for renewable electricity in Trinidad and Tobago. So I would say for Guyana, put in your plans to produce as much as you can, but think about how you can get that electricity to Trinidad and Tobago. The reason why there's a huge demand for electricity in Trinidad and Tobago is that we have all of these ammonia plants now, which are producing ammonia from natural gas. There's a massive opportunity to produce ammonia from water with green hydrogen going into ammonia. The massive demand for that in the world, fetches premium prices. We need the electrons. We need the green electrons to do that, to offset the natural gas now going in which we're now using to make it to ammonia. And you can also offset all the natural gas which is going to electricity in Trinidad as well. So if you can land renewable electricity in Trinidad at the right price point, there is a massive demand for it. So I think that, and this is an idea which CARICOM is exploring. SICRI is leading this conversation. I think it's a fantastic idea about linking together all of the electricity grids across the region. So including hydro from Guyana, including solar from Guyana, but also including geothermal from the Eastern Caribbean, massive resources of geothermal, big market Trinidad. If we can make that together, that could be a really, really interesting and sort of transformational project. So I think the answer to how far and how fast we want to go with renewables is let's think beyond each country. Let's think of the region as a whole, and as far and as fast as we possibly can. I think is my answer.
And if I may add to, and honestly, right now, investors are tripping over themselves, coming to Guyana for all sorts of things, hydrogen, all these different things, all right, in terms of the transportation sector and so on. And that is where, as a regulator, an agency like mine are so burdened by all of these interests. And of course, these interests got to be guided by the policymakers. And once there is clearance from the policymakers, then the Environmental Protection Act kicks in and then evaluates whether the final projects are approved. And yes, there is considered, and you have heard President Ali speak this at various forums, of taking the gas, because the gas that's been produced offshore is significant. And we don't see it being fully consumed here in Guyana. It will have to be exported. And so whatever, I don't know how they intend to do that, But of course, I see that potential future growth for export.
Dr. Sobers, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, on something that's slightly different, and that would be the feed-in tariffs at the last Guyana meeting. When the floor was open, that was something that business and private individuals were very interested in. Feed-in tariffs, and so it turns out Guyana Power and Light was there, and it seems that it's something that it's on the cards, but it doesn't seem that is a high priority, right? It takes a bit of doing, and I think that is something that in building a resilient and a strong and an energy supply, feed-in tariffs is definitely something that would take it to the next level, and it would introduce some redundancy, some participation from a wider source.
Thank you. So, it's always amazing to me how quickly these conversations chew up the hour. And so forgive me a bit of partiality here. I wanted to ask Dr. Trotz to he's the dean in some sense. He has been the dean and has been a dean for many of us. So I wanted to ask him to amplify some key takeaways for us to give us a sense of, as we look down the road, how we manage this paradox effectively.
Well, as I said, one of our biggest constraints in addressing climate change issues, both on the mitigation side, which is about transforming the energy sector, which is critical for the Caribbean, and on the adaptation side, which is building resilience to the changes that we are already living with, is a question of resources. We now have an opportunity to more or less marshal the type of resources that we need for that transformation in a proper time frame. As I said, we are also running out of time in terms of our ability to react. Just think for a second that a country like Holland, Amsterdam, with a similar challenges, low coastline like Guyana, they can afford to put in place a flood risk management system for a 1 in 1,000 year event. We in poor developing countries could hardly put in place the flood risk requirements for a yearly event. So it's resources. We now have an opportunity with the resources we are generating to accelerate that transformation, not only in Guyana, but for the rest of the Caribbean. And I feel very strongly for these opportunities to be taken on board. The developed countries have been very keen to support mitigation because it's an investment. For adaptation, the outcome of adaptation is usually a public good, better drainage, better infrastructure, etc. They are not interested in investing in that. So as a region, what I think we should look at is getting our own investment fund for a transformation in the energy sector. Talking at this time about going back to Petro-Carib with Venezuela, I think is not the way for the Caribbean to go. We have the internal resources between Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname to internalize the whole supply chain for fuel during the transition to zero carbon, so that we're talking about food security, which is another priority. And Dax has pointed out about the Point Lisa's facilities are there. We can generate, we can produce all of the fertilizer inputs for food security in the Caribbean, bringing those facilities out of mothball. And the ammonia hydrogen link is critical. It's going to be a very not only in the Caribbean, but globally. That's a big marketing opportunity that we should see. And for the diaspora, I think that there is an excellent opportunity if we put together that investment fund for energy transformation. As I said, the internal rate of return on energy investments is very high. It's one of the safest investments these days. Diaspora investment, along with the rest of the region in this sector, I think is one opportunity for diaspora basically to be part of this transformation. And I must end on a pet topic of mine. And we've been exploring years ago with Trinidad and Tobago about using their energy facilities with the silica sand deposits in Guyana, which are optical fiber purity, to basically produce pure silica, which is the basic building material for the photovoltaic industry. I think we should keep these things in mind. I think we have to be very ambitious. I think it's a tremendous opportunity. And finally, Kemraj, I must say, I should have said this earlier, that we have to ensure that as we are producing, that we do so in a manner that basically is informed by international good practice, to ensure that carbon footprint meets the minimal the standards, international standards for good practice, and also minimal impact on our marine and coastal ecosystems, which are so critical in terms of our future use of our natural resources as the pedestal for our development. Thank you, Terence.
If I can quickly respond, if you don't mind.
Kemraj, you get this one, and then we go to David to say thanks.
Sure. So, Dr. Trotz, thank you indeed. Yes, two things. One, the funny part is that, indeed, as I mentioned, that apart from the Environmental Protection Act and the guidelines in there, international standard and best practices is part and parcel of what we use in our permitting. What I went through there was just a few of the key conditions that we put in terms of regulating the industry. There's a suite, and you can look at our permits, which are available online, to see the broad and specific measures that we put in place to regulate the sector. Now, you mentioned the aspect of silica sand and the use for production of solar panels. Now, obviously, you're creating more work for me, because now it means there'll be more mining, right? So that's a chicken and egg. Anyway, and by the way, Dr. Trotz was my mentor years ago at the University of the West Indies when he started out CPAC in the days of CPAC. Good to see you, Dr.
Long time.
Glad to facilitate this reunion. David, you get the last word to close us out here. We've gone past the hour.
Well, thank you all very much. This has been excellent, just as we planned. And just curiously, episode 3, which will be on Wednesday, August 10th, again, our second Wednesday of every month, is going to focus on how can we leverage these revenues we're all talking about to produce a world-class 21st century education system in Guyana, but I would say throughout the Caribbean, incorporating many of these issues you've been discussing, the technology opportunities, the investment opportunities, the role of the diaspora, and particularly the science, Caribbean science development that can be used to transform what we're doing, and the linkage to the environment, to the ecosystems, and at the end of the day, the daily livelihood of our peoples. So I want to thank everybody. Terence, excellent setup today. Dax, Lorraine, Professor Trotz, Mr. Kemraj, thank you so much for joining us. To the audience internationally and regionally online, we look forward to seeing you in 4 weeks, and enjoy your summer recess, those of you who have it.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Much, much appreciated.